So before the actual video itself starts, there's something I want to talk about. I was planning on having this video done by the 31st of May. That was my target, that was my goal, and I was going to hit that. And I was very close to. I started writing the script on the 24th, it was done by the 27th, I had beaten the game, I'd gotten a bunch of footage, etc, etc, etc. And then my uncle unexpectedly passed away. And I took some time to mourn, as any reasonable person would, and that is why this video is out later. I know I didn't have a set date publicly, but I figured I would provide some sort of explanation. This video is also going to be dedicated to him and his memory. I miss him very much. I love you, Uncle Mike. Rest in peace. With that being said, thank you for your understanding, and on with the video. Warhammer 40,000 Boltgun is a game that honestly should have been made a really long time ago, and honestly the 40k setting is perfect for this type of game, given the factions and the enemies, the weapons, all of it. It's 90s FPS game material out of the box, and this game for me is an easy 8 out of 10. It does the boom shooting well, and the Warhammer setting well. Now, full disclosure, I haven't been a Warhammer fan for a super long time. I only last year started paying attention to it. I knew what Warhammer was, I knew what a Space Marine was, but that was literally it. And through listening to Adeptus Ridiculous and Luton videos, along with a bunch of other people, Pancreas No Work, etc., at the grocery store job that I was working at the time, which made the experience of working there more bearable, I was hooked. And at that time, Boltgun had just been announced. And I was like, oh crap, that looks really cool. I'm going to play that. Fast forward a few months, the Indomitus Crusade audiobook bundle launches on Humble Bundle. I listened to a few, and at that point, I'm just completely sold. And since then, I've been a die-hard, obsessive fan. I've made my own independent Space Marine chapter with its own lore. I have played so many Warhammer games on Steam that my Steam replay has most of it being Warhammer games. I may or may not have developed a fixation, but that's not the point. This game is not only a great shooter, but it's a game that I'd recommend to anyone who likes games of that type. And not only that, it really does the Warhammer 40k universe justice in more ways than one. The game's plot is paper thin. It's a boomer shooter plot. You would honestly get more information out of an attrition facts label. Basically, Graia is under attack again. The Inquisition wants you, a Sternguard veteran of the Ultramarines chapter, to clean up this mess because apparently Captain Titus did not kill that Chaos Lord hard enough. So after the Inquisition decides you and the rest of your Ultra buddies are bad enough dudes to save the Imperium, you make planetfall, and despite the powers bestowed on you by Matt Ward, the rest of your Ultra buddies are now Ultra dead. So now you basically are just left with a bunch of demons, cultists, and Black Legion to wade through, because this is a Warhammer game, and if there isn't a copious amount of completely over-the-top violence, the game is doing it wrong. The first thing I noticed immediately was the movement. You move fast, even fast by boomer shooter standards. Given that a Space Marine in 40k lore is already a boomer shooter protagonist by themselves, I mean, look at them, they could eat Master Chief for breakfast. You move at light speeds, running literal circles around your enemies and strafe jumping to your heart's content. The speed itself is not the only thing that I noticed. The weight of your character is conveyed via the sound design. You have really loud footsteps, and when even running into a wall, you make a very loud noise, and if you fall a significant distance, it will sound like two semi-trucks just smashing into each other. You can even Goomba stop enemies if you want to. The speed combined with the weight makes the movement incredibly satisfying and energetic, and circle strafing has not been this much fun in a long time for me. Past the movement itself, the gameplay loop is a mix of classic boomer shooter level progression and Serious Sam style, hey, we're gonna lock you in a room with several enemies type of gameplay. The enemies and weapons are all well designed, they look great, and they sound great as well. In fact, most of the enemies are based on miniatures that are just digitized. I mean, look at that great unclean one. That is literally just the miniature. The enemies themselves, barring boss level ones, are never particularly threatening on their own. It's when they're in groups that creates a major problem. With proper movement and awareness, this is not an issue unless you get cornered. There are 3 different enemy classes: cultists, Chaos Space Marines being represented by the Black Legion, and Chaos Demons. Standard cultists are armed with rifles, big machine guns, or plasma guns. Surprisingly, they aren't hit scan at all, but do lead their shots on higher difficulties. And they're pretty easy to deal with. They're one-shotted by literally every weapon, and while some are a bit beefier, that beef equates to taking 1 extra bolter shell to the face. The Chaos Space Marine enemies are mid-power and all deal significant damage to the player if caught off guard. The standard Chaos Space Marine and Terminators are the most common early on, with Champions becoming more and more common as the game goes on. The most threatening of the 3 are the Terminators and the Champions, because the Terminators in groups are a hassle given they basically have an A10 Warthog's main gun as their standard weapon, and the Champions have both melee and ranged attacks, along with ridiculous movement speed that turns dealing with them into a game of tag with extra plasma gun. Better yet, as the game goes on, the Champions themselves can get resurrected by the Chaos Gods, which results in them being even faster and dealing more damage. Early on, these guys are a major pain in the ass, but once you get the Melta and plasma guns, they immediately get bodied. But it still doesn't change the fact that these guys in groups are annoying as hell to fight. The last group of enemies are the Demons, which are represented by the Chaos Gods of Tzeentch and Nurgle, and these enemies are easily the most dangerous, and getting caught by them will either result in an evening of severe mental trauma or irritable bowel syndrome. Both the Demons of Tzeentch and Nurgle have archetypal enemies that tend to serve the same purpose. For example, the Nurglings and Blue Horrors both rush you and go down in one shot. The Plague Drones and Screamers do basically the same thing, except the Plague Drones lack a melee attack, and the mid-level demons, like the Plague Toads, both of the variants, the lesser and greater ones, and the Pink Horrors do the same thing, except with the Pink Horrors, when they die, they do mitosis and spawn 2 Blue Horrors, which turns dealing them into a game of whack-a-mole with extra demons. In general, you will never see both demon factions in the same level, except when fighting the Chaos Sorcerer who spawns enemies in endlessly. And I actually like this because in the lore, Tzeentch and Nurgle hate each other. And this is because they represent different things ideologically. Nurgle represents disease and stagnation, the willingness to accept one's place and not really change it. While Tzeentch is the opposite of that. He wants to change things, and he's willing to bring about that change through funny schemes and all that other crap. And the main differences in the enemies themselves comes down to the fact that Nurgle enemies are primarily higher HP and prioritize ranged attacks, while Tzeentch enemies tend to be lower HP but engage in more melee attacks and tend to move faster. The main enemies that really interest me, though, are the boss enemies. The Lord of Change, the Sorcerer, and the Great Unclean One all show up multiple times throughout the campaign, and some are more fun than others, and some are a complete pain in the ass to take down. Lord of Change is some weird big bird looking thing that can shoot a torrent of fireballs at you and basically do the Archvile attack from Dune 2 without the warm-up. Fighting these things are incredibly annoying, and it wouldn't be such a pain if they actually had an attack lined up for the not Archvile attack. They can also teleport around, and your best bet is to plasma gun the thing to death and pop in and out of cover to take the thing down. They do get easier once more weapons appear, but honestly, dealing with these things, and because of that one Archvile attack, if it just had a wind-up, it probably would be less of a pain in the butt to fight. The Great Unclean One Boomer is actually fun to fight, and is basically what happens when Santa Claus pledges himself to the service of hell, craps himself, and then proceeds to give you space aids. This enemy not only looks amazing, but is actually a fun boss to fight. This dude has a variety of attacks. He has a sword attack when you get close, he projectile vomits at you, which is pleasant. He can spawn a bunch of Nurglings at random and has this big funny bell that does AoE damage. Of all the bosses, he does not mess around. He actually puts up a fight, and as a result, it's actually fun. I easily died to the Great Unclean One the most out of any enemy in the game, and honestly, every single time he showed up, I enjoyed the boss fight. I actually looked forward to fighting him the several times I did, and this is a well-designed fight. Good job. The last of the boss enemies is the Chaos Sorcerer. You fight this guy a few times throughout the game, and for some reason the first few times he shows up, he isn't named. Trust me, he's the same guy. The Sorcerer as an enemy is challenging, but for the wrong reasons, because all he does is spawn in tons of enemies and teleports around. He has a fireball attack, as well as this railgun laser thing that actually does pretty good damage to the player, and he can also make it so you can't damage him, because he'll project this blue beam that will make it so you have to kill that thing before you shoot at him, so that could be either a Great Unclean One or a Cultist, and it's kind of a pain in the ass to deal with, especially when it's a beefier enemy like the aforementioned Great Unclean One. To be completely honest, this enemy boring to fight. The enemies he spawns are easily more dangerous than he is, and it's more just turns into a wild goose chase because he just teleports around every single time you do damage to him. In the first boss fight, given how open the arena is, especially the last one as well, it's just a pain in the butt. He's not fun to fight. I don't enjoy fighting him. He's incredibly annoying. Oh, there's these enemies called ambuls as well. There's some Xeno species that show up in some caves, and they really aren't that important. There is one boss variant, but they just charge at you and punch you around. They aren't really all that remarkable, but their design is pretty cool. Weapons in this game are fantastic across the board. Everything is punchy, looks great, and sounds great. All the Space Marine classics are here. Chainsword is always at your ready and comes with a lunge attack. It's basically your default melee, and it's quite useful. The bolter, which is reliable throughout the entire game, including its various ammo pickups, which are superb and work really, really well. And given the fact that this is basically a 75 caliber fully automatic rocket launcher, it's going to take down most things, lower mid-level enemies. It works incredibly well. And this also applies to the heavy bolter, which is the same thing, but bigger and belt-fed, and it's a higher fire rate and does more damage. It's just the bolter, but more boltery. Shotgun in this game, courtesy of the Deathwatch, is actually quite good. It's very useful for crowd control and can even take down a Chaos Terminator in 4 shots. It seems to be firing some really big shell. Probably it's some like 4 gauge or something. It's absolutely massive, and it's fun. It's good. It's a decent shotgun. It's not the best shotgun I've ever used in an FPS game, but it's alright. It does the job well. The plasma gun functions as a rocket launcher of sorts, and this is very useful against enemies that have high health points, particularly against the bosses. You can also hold down the fire button where it will fire faster, but eventually it will overheat, which is actually nice, because when it overheats, it starts to do more damage, but it'll also damage the player, so it creates a risk-reward thing. And it's also nice that it doesn't do the lore thing where if it overheats, it actually just explodes in your hands. The Melt-A-Gun is a shotgun-railgun hybrid. It can pass through cover and is really fun for clearing out entire groups of enemies instantly. Cheesing Chaos Terminators with this thing feels gross, in a good way, and it's quite busted. If the shotgun can't kill something at close range, this will definitely do the job. The Vengeance Launcher from Space Marine comes back, and it's pretty good. It has a really good trajectory and is basically just a space Milcore. So, if you like grenade launchers, use it. It's fine. The Volkite Caliver is your, like, laser beam type of weapon. It's really quite useful. It can drain enemies' health very, very quickly. But it's also interesting because of its lore, because these were used during the Great Crusade, and they weren't used anytime afterwards because they lost the technology to make them. So that means that this weapon in the game is probably more than 10,000 years old, which is actually pretty neat. The last weapon is the Grav Cannon, and it's basically the Volkite Caliver with the Halo 3 gravity hammer effect attached to it. It does a ridiculous amount of damage, and it turns literally everything into paste. I use this thing every chance I get. It gives you ammo for it quite frequently, but it only comes in pickups of 10, so you have to pick up a bunch of them to actually make it worth your while. But once you unload on an entire room full of guys, they just disappear. All the weapons in the game are fantastic. They're well designed, and they all have a use. I tended to stick with the bolters, the Melt-A-Gun, and the Plasma Gun, but I used everything else other than that. The weapon I used the least was easily the shotgun, because in terms of close range, I either liked the Melt-A-Gun, the chain sword, or the heavy bolter more. It was just a personal preference thing. It's not a bad weapon, but I just found other things that I liked more. Overall, this weapon arsenal is very well-rounded, and it does the boomer shooter arsenal thing very, very well. Oh, you also get grenades. Those are really cool. There's 3 types: frag, crack, and vortex. Frag grenades are frag grenades. I don't need to explain what those do. Crack grenades detonate on impact, and given that they're an anti-vehicle weapon, it's very funny to one-shot standard Chaos Space Marines with them. They just pop, and it's funny to watch. And the Vortex grenade opens up a wormhole into the warp. It sucks everything in, and it does a ridiculous amount of damage. All of them are very useful. The Vortex grenade is kind of rare, but once you get into Episode 3, they start to show up everywhere. Overall, the grenades are pretty good, and I really like using them. The level design in this game is absolutely fantastic. It's simple, but layered, and often the paths link in back on themselves, and I even got lost a few times, which is surprising because I have not gotten lost in a video game of any sort ever in such a long time, and once I realized that and was happy about it, I immediately Googled where to go because I'm trying to play the game and have fun. The levels themselves, in terms of aesthetic, are very similar to Space Marine, which makes sense because it's on the same planet. There's a consistent visual style present in all the locations, whether it's a gothic castle, a hellic chaotic landscape, or a simple industrial factory or military outpost. Everything has a clear attention to detail. Even as the game progresses, you can see the chaos corruption of the landscape, with Nordles rotting cave walls or Zeech's glowy goo crap emerging and corrupting the landscape as well. The aesthetic itself is something I'm going to call clerical militarism, and it really nails the art style of both the Imperium, but Chaos as well, and looks about as good in terms of environmental design as both Deathwing and Darktide, but as its boomer shooter equivalent. And the fact that it looks as good as both of those games in terms of environmental design is a testament to the art team. You guys did a fantastic job. In terms of major criticisms, I would say that the game itself, if it didn't have the Warhammer branding, would probably not be getting as positive a reception as it is. The game itself is not bad by any means, and it's probably by itself a 7.5 out of 10. But what elevates is how well the developers did the Warhammer license justice. The game itself, honestly, is pretty easy, and it really didn't allow me to flex my boomer shooter brain muscles all that much. That being said, it still does have moments of challenge. But it's not challenge in, say, games like Doom Eternal where you have to outsmart your enemies. It's more like having to outshoot them and being fast enough to do so. That being said, it's still a really fun game, and if you like boomer shooters, this one is definitely worth a shot. That being said, Boltgun itself is a really great game. In my opinion, it's one of the better Warhammer games to come out in the last few years, and in my opinion, it's one of the standout titles in the Warhammer license. Alongside games like Space Marine, the original Dawn of War, and the Total War games, this ranks among them as one of the best games for new players to get into the Warhammer franchise. As a boomer shooter, it's a really solid game. As a Warhammer game, it does everything right. And is one of the better modern examples as to why boomer shooters can still work in the modern day gaming market. Boomer shooters are in, and they have been for quite some time. And to be honest, it's kind of ironic that the day after this game is released, a new Marathon game gets announced, and it's basically Space Tarkov. And that already exists. It's called Marauders. I really enjoyed this game, and I'm probably going to play through it again very soon, if not after I'm done editing this video. Also, a good friend of mine, Razor, you know, the guy who gave me shit about not doing the zombies Easter eggs, he made a video last week, and I'm in it. So, if you don't mind, go over and give him a sub and leave a nice comment saying I sent you here. It's a really great video, and he's a really good friend of mine, so, yeah, show him some support. Black Ops 2 video is next. Have a good night, everyone.